Okay, it is the week ending September 29th. I have neurocopy in hand, so I'm ready to rock and roll with this week's Q&A and a little bit of week in review. So we're going to hit on a couple of anatomy apps real quick at the beginning. We'll talk a little bit about meditation, power output in regards to fluid mechanics. Should I go back to school? That was a really interesting question this week. But I think the big topic of the week would be hip mechanics. There's been a lot of questions on the intensive group, the people who've gone through the intensive, so there's a lot of questions there. And there's been some stuff floating around, as you've probably seen, in regards to people trying to demonstrate certain elements of how the hip actually moves. And so we're going to clarify that for you today as well. So let's have at it. So a couple of things for the week in review. If you go to the YouTube channel, I threw up another segment from the Pain-Free Powerlifting Seminar, which is really cool because you get to see a couple of changes that were made very simply with just a couple of typical gym exercises. One was a loaded carry, and the other one was a split squat. And so you can actually see changes in available range of motion and comfort in a rather large, strong human being. So again, we don't have to use rehabilitative type exercises to access these ranges of motion, especially for the guys that aren't in terrible pain and still want to train. Also, I got this week in the mail 10 more copies of Conscious Coaching from my buddy Brett Bartholomew. If you have not read this book, you need to get it. I'm going to open up the link to have you submit your 3 sentences as to why you deserve a free copy. And if I like what you say, I'm going to send you a free copy of Conscious Coaching. So make sure you take advantage of that. Okay, so we'll get to hip mechanics here at the end of this video, but I wanted to touch on a couple things that came up this week. So I made a little post about the value of cadaver anatomy. I'm not real strong on the cadaver anatomy anymore. I've sort of changed my bias in that regard as to its usefulness and when it might be useful. So go back and you can watch that on the Instagram. And but I did want to throw out, it's like, does anybody have any other apps that they're finding of value? And the one that kept coming up and through email and through Instagram was Complete Anatomy. And so I think that's my current bias. So I would suggest that if you're looking for an anatomy app that is consistently useful and gives a great representation, easy to manipulate, I think that Complete Anatomy right now is my current favorite. I reserve the right to change my opinion if I find something better. Also had a couple book recommendations from Levi, The Culture Solution by Matthew Kelly, and my girl Katie Sinclair, Mind in Motion from Barbara Tversky. I've not read either of those books, so I suggest that if you're looking for your next read, that you go to Amazon, read some reviews, or contact Levi Kirkpatrick or Katie Sinclair, and they can give you a little bit of background on those 2 books. My Russian friend, who, again, I cannot pronounce anything on his Instagram, sent me a paper in regards to the coupling of respiratory and attention via the Locus Coeruleus effects of meditation and pranayama. And so this brings up a really interesting point about meditation, because I'm a big proponent of it in regards to self-regulation. I think you need to be able to regulate yourself before you try to do anything else. And the neat thing about this is it looked at the difference between the top-down elements and the bottom-up, if you will. So the top-down elements in regards to direction of attention and management of attention in regards to meditation is involving a simple focus on the breathing. So not intentionally manipulating the breathing, but just simple focus. And so that's more of the prefrontal self-regulatory element of meditation. However, by manipulating breathing, so for instance, breathing in for a certain duration, exhaling for a certain duration, so some would refer to that as box breathing, or extending the duration of your exhales to improve your tolerance to CO2, that's a bottom-up influence, which has been shown to actually help self-regulate in situations of anxiety. So people with a higher tolerance of CO2 tend to be able to manage anxiety a little bit better. So take a look at that paper if you're interested in it. I'll go ahead and I'll post it up on my website, and you can take a look at that. So that's kind of interesting. Coming from Instagram again. So what are the primary constraints to manipulate in an exercise for maximum power output in terms of fluid dynamics? So that's a really good question because there's a lot of stuff in play. And I think that especially during high power activities, so jumping, sprinting, etc., we tend to look at this extremity-based sort of a peripheral representation of what's going on, when I think in reality it is the internal pressure control and fluid dynamics that become infinitely more important. And so if we look at what has to manage all of the pressures above it, we go to the pelvic diaphragm as one of the primary influences. It's not that we're negating anything above, but the pelvic diaphragm has to catch all of the pressures that are coming down, and it has to be able to reverse the volume influences that are getting pushed down into the pelvis. So for instance, if you were to counter movement jump, which would be the quick descent and then followed by the jump, as you descend, there's a slight delay, so the body moves, the internal organs would move in opposition, in the opposite direction, and then they would come down. So as you're trying to turn the jump around, the guts essentially are moving down into the pelvic diaphragm, and then the pelvic diaphragm has to be able to push up back against it to allow you to unweight the body. So again, we have to sort of create this anti-gravity position of the guts to overcome their influence, because the internal volume creates a downward force. And if we can't reverse that, then you're never going to get off the ground. And so there's certain relationships in regards to the size of the thorax and to the size of the pelvis that can negatively influence the ability to jump. In opposition of that, if I have a funnel-shaped thorax to pelvis relationship, chances are I'm a much better jumper. I can run much faster than normal human beings simply because of the influence of these internal physics. But at the bottom of this thing is where we really have to make our focus. So we have to have this pelvic diaphragm control. There's a number of ways that we can influence this. By exercise selection, not just by doing plyometric activities or jumping related activities, especially when we work with some females that are a little bit taller. So we get a lot of volleyball players at IFAST, and so when they're dealing with their personal structural mechanics that may negatively influence their ability to manage these pressures, we have to come up with creative ways to help them unweight the pelvic diaphragm, recapture these concentric orientations that allow them to leave the ground. So let me throw out kudos to our guy Eric Huddleston at IFAST. So Eric's a very, very intelligent coach, and he came up with an activity that he posted on his Instagram. So it's Eric Huddleston, Eric with a K, Huddleston, Huddleston. Go to his Instagram, and you'll see a little bounce variation of a squat that I thought was brilliant, and it worked fabulously for the girl in the video. So I suggest you check that out, and that'll give you an idea of what we're talking about in regards to helping to produce high power outputs against the internal fluid dynamics. And I can always expand on that. So if there's a question about that you may have, please feel free to ask it on Instagram. Okay, where are we at? Oh, so I had a couple things come in through email. So askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com. And remember, in the subject line, you want to put Ask Bill Hartman question. Otherwise, I'm going to delete it. So coming in through email, this happened on 2 occasions. I had 2 people ask about going back to school. So the question is should I go back to school to get a degree? And I tend to answer questions with questions because people aren't sure what questions to ask themselves, and that's why they ruminate over these thoughts of what should I be doing. The first thing that I would ask you is why do you feel that something is missing? What is education going to provide you that you can't acquire now? Because essentially all information is free at this point. And so it's not an acquisition of information. It's not a gaining of new knowledge. I think that is the limiting factor. I think that you have to decide on 3 things as to why you might want to go back to school. Is it just a matter, number 1, is it just a matter of the environment that you're working in? So is that environment providing you the stimulation and support that allows you to work with the people that you want to work with, experience the things you want to experience, and then gain knowledge and understanding in the realm that you're desiring. And so that's step one. It's like, maybe I just need a change of environment. Sometimes that's seeking out a new job. Sometimes it's going to your employer and saying, hey, I would like to work on this, and getting the permission to do that. If you're a business owner, then maybe it's about seeking out a different type of clientele. And so then you just create your avatar for the ideal client that you're wanting to work with. And then everything that you do from a marketing standpoint is to acquire that type of a client. And so those would be an environmental influence. The other thing is what type of client do I want to work with, and does it require a credential? So getting a master's degree or PhD may not be the solution, but maybe acquiring a professional degree will allow you to work with the type of clientele that you want to work with. So say I want to work with more rehab or clients that are dealing with pain-related issues. Maybe that requires a physical therapy degree for you to do those things. So in that case, education probably would be the solution if you want to work in that environment and with that clientele. So in that case, now you do have to pursue an advanced degree. But if it's just acquiring the knowledge and understanding, all of that stuff is available for free. And so, again, I think the question you first ask yourself is, what do I really want to do? And that's probably the hardest question that everybody has to answer in anything that they do. And I think that because it is ill-defined in many cases, that's where the stress comes from, is not really knowing, not really making a decision. Because once you make that decision, a lot of good things fall in place, because then the resources sort of present themselves once you have made the decision that this is what I really want to do. So consider that before you decide that I'm going to go back to school, and you commit yourself to something that ultimately does not fulfill what you're trying to achieve. I wanted to make another point in regards to education and what direction to take your education. Is many times it's just the association with other people. And so obviously I'm a big proponent of mentorship and the apprenticeship concept, especially in regards to the fitness industry and the rehab industries, because I think that's where we're lacking. We're not getting enough of that type of an influence in regards to capturing experience and being able to utilize someone else's experience to our advantage. So here's what I would say, that if you're sort of stuck, you decided that, okay, school's not the way for me to go, there's plenty of information for me to consume for free. So if you need foundational sciences, physics, biology, chemistry, it doesn't matter. It's like all that's free. You can take an MIT physics course for free if you wanted to. So again, let's take that off the table. That's acquisition of information that is entirely up to you. But I would say that the influence of the people that you surround yourself with. So try this as an exercise. If I was unlimited as to who I could select, who are the 6 people that I would want sitting around the table that were all helping me to become the best version of myself. And so figure out who those 6 people would be, preferably living, and then maybe start to make some contacts. It's like, so again, start with this unlimited viewpoint. It doesn't matter who it is, make some initial contact with them, and perhaps that they'd be willing to help you. So this could be done locally, or this could be done at a distance. So again, my mentorship program, I have outreach into other countries, which is a little odd to me, but again, the internet has made the world small. Maybe you need to keep it within your community. Maybe you need to keep it within your own business, and simply create an environment of openness and discussion that maybe you don't already have, and maybe that is sufficient to satisfy your needs. But let's go back and let's pick these 6 people, and let's say, how can I help them? What can I do for them? And in return, maybe they can help you at the same time. So that's something to consider, is just reach out. In many cases, people are so willing to help you just for the benefit of helping someone else. You'd be surprised how nice people are. So as long as you have something that you are willing to offer them in return for their assistance, maybe it's financial, maybe it's through promotion or some other method, or maybe it's just they do it out of the kindness of their heart. And there are many times where somebody just asks me a favor, and I'm very, very happy to fulfill that. So just take that into consideration when you're talking about education and what direction you need to go to fulfill what you perceive as your desired outcome. So let's talk a little bit about hip mechanics. I'm gonna talk you through 3 different presentations that will give you an idea of how you can actually manipulate positions and orientations to create a stronger influence towards external rotation, range of motion of a hip, or internal rotation, range of motion of a hip. And so I'm going to start with just a simple representation of the pelvis in some imaginary mid-range position that you would see in a textbook. So we're going to assume that this is somehow mid-range. We have a normal position of a femur at 0 degrees of hip extension, but I want you to notice that the greater trochanter is a little bit more posterior because the femur tends to enter the acetabulum in a superior anterior direction. So we're kind of biased towards external rotation here. And so from a pelvic mechanics standpoint, for the muscles, this would be a relative position of inhalation, so we have some eccentric orientation of the pelvic diaphragm in this position. If I was to fix the pelvis from moving and simply move the femur in isolation, I would move upwards into hip flexion, and as I do so, some of the musculature of the hip that is external rotation biased in this 0 position becomes internal rotation biased. So what I'll have then is I'll have this trochanter moving a little bit more superior relative to its entry into the acetabulum, and in doing so I create an internal rotation moment at the hip as I pass through this mid-range. And so then what happens is I'll see the mechanics relative to the femur influence the pelvis. And so as I move through this internal rotation moment, all the musculature that produces internal rotation of the hip will influence this pelvic outlet position, so I'll become a little bit more concentrically oriented, which is an exhalation bias. And so this is traditionally the sticking point in the squat. So my ability to move from this eccentric to concentric orientation of the pelvic diaphragm tends to be a limitation at some certain load in squatting. So now you have an idea of how you can influence that sticking point in the squat and how to get through it. Now, that's if I fix the position of the pelvis. But what if I change the orientation of the pelvis? So I take the entire pelvis and I move it towards the femur, or I push the femur posteriorly in the acetabulum, which creates the same orientation. And so some of you may bias your activities as such in an attempt to acquire certain ranges of motion. So if I turn the entire pelvis, so an absolute position of the pelvis, I've immediately biased myself into internal rotation. The same mechanics are still in play as I move through this full hip excursion. So if I start an internal rotation bias to begin with by moving the whole pelvis into this position, I will gain even more internal rotation influence as I come through the arc of that sticking point that we were talking about before. Now you have to be careful with that, because if I'm orienting the entire pelvis, or if I actually nutate the sacrum and orient the pelvis towards the femur, I'm actually moving towards a compressive strategy on the front of the hip. So a lot of people will present with the diagnosis of hip impingement under those circumstances. So beware when you have a client or a patient that complains of that anterior compression. Chances are they're not managing the position of the pelvis as well as you would like them to. Now, if I change the relative position of the sacrum and the ilium, so if I'm going to move this towards a position of counternutation, what's going to happen is the relative position of the ilium, because of the shape of the SI joint, the relative position of the ilium is as such that I now retrovert the acetabulum. And so that immediately puts me into an external rotation bias. Now, again, as I move through the excursion of hip flexion, I'm still going to move through that sticking point, but now I'm biasing it more towards external rotation or an inhaled position. So if I'm externally rotated, I'm eccentrically biased in the pelvic diaphragm, and then as I move through this mid-range arc of the sticking point, I'm still going to move towards internal rotation. So I'm still going to get some concentric orientation of the pelvic diaphragm, I'm still going to get internal rotation of the femur, but I'm just going to be biased a little bit more towards external rotation. And so that will give you an idea of what you're actually representing as you move through these activities. So I can take a split squat and I can orient my client or my patient as such that I can emphasize more internal or more external rotation through the hip. So it's not one or the other, it's a bias towards one or the other. So stop thinking in absolutes and start thinking more towards bias. So I have respiratory influences, I have positional influences that are absolute or relative depending on where I'm positioning them. And so I have to consider those things when I'm making decisions as to what activities my clients are participating in, what exercises I'm selecting, based on the outcome that's desired. So food for thought in regards to hip mechanics.